We'll also have many people afterwards who are going to watch this on YouTube. So welcome to everybody today, and welcome to everyone in the future when you are watching this. I'm Zach Rosenthal. I am the host for today and the director of the Duke Center for Misophonia and Emotion Regulation. I am thrilled to be able to bring to you a wonderful speaker and brilliant junior scientist, Marie-Anick Savard, who is going to talk about what makes triggers triggering in misophonia and what we can do about it. And I'm just going to say a couple of things before we launch into her presentation. First, for those of you who are new to our center, this is a picture of most of us here on the left welcoming you. This is our email address if you'd like to be engaged with the work we're doing and learn more about misophonia, have access to resources about misophonia, directly communicate with me or others. Feel free to reach out to us through our website, really anytime. All of our videos that we record, we save and we post on our YouTube channel. There's no cost for any of what we do here. It is all generously supported philanthropically by largely by an anonymous family, as well as by a number of anonymous families that provide smaller amounts of funding. So thank you to all of you who do that. On the right side of the screen, this is just a sort of a snapshot of our Instagram page, if you will. So we're at Duke Center for Misophonia. If you're on Instagram and you want to sort of stay connected in that way, please do feel free to connect with us. And anybody listening can always reach out to me directly. It says mark.rosenthal@duke.edu. I go by Zach. Please call me Zach. Nobody calls me Mark, not even my family. It's just the first name. So please feel free to be comfortable reaching out anytime. We want to acknowledge a few people who are our close collaborators and partners in the work we do at Duke CMER. In particular, for our webinar series, we want to thank and acknowledge Dr. Jennifer Brout, who really was a key inspiration for us many years ago in getting all of this work started. So thank you to Dr. Brout, who is not able to be with us, unfortunately, today. We are lucky to have the founder and director of SoQuiet.org, Cris Edwards, here with us today. Thank you, Cris, for everything you do for the Misosphere, including coining the term Misosphere, which I always give you credit for. So thank you for everything you do. And for those of you here for today, Cris is going to be moderating the end of the presentation. He'll be moderating our discussion section along with me and Marie-Anick. Thank you to my team who helps coordinate this, and a particular shout out to Emily Pisani and Lisa Kelly, who are the ones that make sure everything actually goes smoothly. They get all the credit for that. Thank you to everybody on our team, and again to the anonymous supporting families. We literally wouldn't exist without funding. We wouldn't be doing anything that we do without funding from families who have the ability to give. So thank you to all of you who do that. And thank you to all the advocates out there supporting research, education, and treatment of misophonia more broadly. Some of you are here today. Some of you we know. We're really grateful for everything you do, whether you're a scientist or a clinician, a parent, a family member, a funder, really anybody, anywhere in the Misosphere. Thank you for what you do. So for today, I've just done the welcoming remarks. We're now going to shift gears into the presentation, which is really the majority of what we'll do today, what makes triggers triggering. Afterwards, we'll have a Q&A. We try to do this so we have about 20 to 30 minutes of Q&A time. It's not perfect. We're organic with this. We'll go with the flow, but we will have some Q&A time at the end. What you should do with your questions along the way is feel free to use the Zoom chat and ask the questions you want to ask in the Zoom chat. We will answer the ones we can answer in the Zoom chat during the presentation, and we'll save questions from the Zoom chat for after the presentation as well. So ask away, ask all the questions. Any question is a good question. If you're new to all this, feel free to ask questions that someone new to all this would ask. It's all good for us. We're happy to do this and to answer any questions. Kind of just a reminder around etiquette for these kinds of events. We've learned through doing this over the years that it's actually very helpful for people to remain on mute. and off camera during the presentation, just to prevent accidentally distracting or even triggering each other. So we'll just ask everyone to be respectful. And when we get to the Q&A, we can invite you to speak. If we do invite you to speak, that's great, speak, but let's try to kind of keep things orderly in a way that isn't inadvertently triggering each other. This group of all groups, I think, can respect and understand that. Okay, so now to the more important part of this, which is our speaker. Marie-Anick Savard is a PhD candidate from Concordia University. She's co-supervised by Dr. Emily Coffey and Dr. Michael DeRoche. And her work is really around misophonia using psychophysiological measures. And she'll tell you a little bit about what those are. These psychophysiological measures are used to look at the effect of cognitive processes on how people respond to trigger sounds. So I am going to now turn my camera off and unshare. Let's see. Let's get this off here. And Marie-Anick, if you want to go ahead and share screen, you are welcome to do so.
Yes. Can you see my slides?
Oops, sorry, there. How about now? Yes, we can see them now. Go for it. I'm going to go on mute and go off video. Please take it away, and thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you. Yes, so hi everyone. Thanks, Zach, for the introduction. Again, my name is Marie-Anick Savard. I'm a PhD student at Concordia University in Montreal, Canada. And I've been asked to come here today to talk a bit about the research that I do. I'll just start by mentioning that I understand that a lot of people here might have misophonia or know someone who has misophonia. So in an attempt to relate to that, I would have to mention that I also have misophonia. That's the main reason why I decided to do research on misophonia and to try to get to understand what's going on in my brain, but also help a lot of people understand what's going on in their brain. So hopefully I can help some people do that today. I thank you everyone for being here. I've seen there's over 50 people. It's crazy to me that that's so many people care about misophonia research and want to learn about it. It's pretty awesome. Yeah, so today I'll be presenting my research in terms of the two projects that I worked on over the past couple of years. Project 1 being about what makes triggers triggering in misophonia, and then project 2 using kind of the knowledge from project 1 to find out ways to better cope with trigger sounds. So I understand that I don't have to explain what misophonia is here. I'm assuming that a lot of people here know what misophonia is. I just put this definition here, which is the latest definition of misophonia, just simply so that we all have the same understanding of what it is and we all get from the same definition. So misophonia is a disorder of decreased tolerance to specific sounds or stimuli associated with such sounds. Triggers are experienced at unpleasant or distressing and evoke strong negative emotional reactions that may include physiological responses like heart rate increases and such. All right, so we can just jump right over in project 1 now that we have our shared understanding of what misophonia is. For project 1, we really wanted to look at what makes triggers triggering. And that was based on what we knew about triggers, that was about 2.5 years ago when we started this project, which was we understood that the experiences with triggers were highly variable, such that people with misophonia that had different triggers than other people with misophonia. And then even within one person, they could have different experiences with some sounds and other sounds or some context and others. It's very variable. And that points to kind of a higher level we call cognitive aspect of misophonia, meaning that there's some kind of effect of the thoughts and the memories that kind of determines whether a misophonic reaction happens. But then also we knew that typical trigger sounds tend to be repetitive, they tend to be pattern-based, they share some acoustic properties that makes them attention grabbing. So that pointed to the idea that maybe it could be the case that there would be something acoustic about those sounds that made them easier to pay attention to, or maybe people with misophonia were better able at detecting those sounds. We really didn't know, and that's kind of what we wanted to look at. So the question we asked was, is identification of sounds important in misophonia? Specifically, is identification of trigger sounds necessary to elicit a misophonic reaction? Meaning, do you have to know that the sound that you're hearing is someone chewing for you to have a misophonic reaction to it? Then on top of that, we also wanted to know, how do people with and without misophonia differ in their ability to identify those sounds, and also their emotional responses to those sounds when they are identified and when they're not identified? And those are the questions that we went into this project with. So to assess those, what we did is we did a study online with 300 adults that we recruited from an online platform from all over the world. And this was due to COVID restrictions at the time that we had to do things online. But it worked out. So what we did is we sent this task to 300 people. The task was to listen to 3 different types of sound, to categories from sounds from 3 different types of categories, sorry. The first category was neutral sounds. And so those would be sounds that people really don't necessarily find unpleasant and are not commonly reported as trigger sounds, like phone ringing or like a washing machine and such. Then there would be unpleasant sounds that are generally seen as unpleasant, but not reported as triggers. And that would include like a dog barking or like a baby crying. And then the trigger sounds included typical triggers like coughing, knife on a plate, paper rustling, sounds like that. So people listen to all of those sounds hidden in different levels of background noise. I represented this here in visual format, but obviously that was an auditory experiment. But basically, we had 5 different levels of background noise, such that at one level, and you can see here on the left, the background noise was much louder than the actual sound that we wanted them to hear. So it was very difficult to identify the sound and perceive it amongst the background noise. Whereas on the other end, the background noise was quieter than the actual sound, so it would be really easy to identify. And by having those 5 different levels of background noise, that allowed us to have some kind of a continuum where we could be like, okay, this person at this level of background noise is able or not to identify the sound. And so it's represented here. You can see this is called the signal to noise ratio. You don't have to remember that, but this is just fancy word for at the lower level of signal to noise ratio, the background noise is loud and it's hard to perceive the sound. And then at higher levels, the sound is easy to identify. The background noise is pretty quiet. Then participants listened to all of those sounds in all of those levels of background noise. And after each of the sound, they had to answer some questions. The questions were, is this sound unpleasant, pleasant? Does this sound make me feel angry, disgusted, or anxious? And they had to rate that along a continuum. Then after answering those questions, they had to identify the sound amongst all the labels of all the sounds in the study, meaning that when at the higher level of signal to noise ratio, when the sounds were really easy to perceive, people would know exactly what they were. But at the lower levels, when the sounds were really hard to perceive, people would kind of just go at random. And based on that, we were able to find at what point in the kind of background noise continuum people were able to identify sounds. So we obviously recruited 300 adults. We did not specifically look for people with misophonia, but we sent all of our participants a misophonia assessment scale. And what we did with that is that we took the bottom 20% and the top 20% and created groups of least misophonic and most misophonic participants to be able to compare them in how well they were able to detect the sounds and their emotional responses to the sounds. So here I have this graph that kind of looks at what point can people identify the sounds. And here I'll just explain really quick. You can see that the levels of background noise are on the y-axis. At the bottom, it's really hard to identify the sound. So if people were able to identify it at -30, they would be really, really good at identifying those sounds. Whereas if people were only able to identify the sounds at the +10 level, then they would be really bad because they would need the background noise to be basically non-existent to be able to recognize the noise. So what we show here is that, yeah, the trigger sounds were more easily identifiable, meaning that they could be identified when the background noise was more present. But in general, the two groups did not differ in how easily they can detect the sounds. We can see here the empty circles are the least misophonic and the filled circles are the most misophonics, and they do not differ from one another. So it's not true that misophonics just have some kind of hypersensitive hearing to some sounds, or it doesn't seem to be the case based on this data. Now, when we look at the actual emotional ratings, we find something different. Here again, I'll explain this graph really quickly. I'm only showing the anger ratings because we found the same things for the other emotional ratings, and that would have been way too many graphs. But here we can see that angry is at 100% anger, neutral is 0% anger. The gray background on the graph means that the sounds are not identified. So it's the ratings of anger when people don't know what the sound is. And then on the white background, it's ratings of anger when people know what the sound is. So if we start off easy, we can look at how people rate sounds when they don't know what they are. Generally, everyone's around 20%. There's not really that much going on. People are not really angry at sounds when they don't know what the sounds are. There's no difference in ratings of negative emotions when sounds are not identified between the groups, and that's true for all of the sounds. Now, if we look at the neutral sounds, when they are identified, there's no change, meaning that people with misophonia are not just sensitive to kind of any sound. They didn't get angry at the neutral sounds that we had. So very much showing that if there's something happening, it's not with any sound. Now, I know what you're interested in is what happens when we look at the trigger sounds. Well, when the sounds were identified, the most misophonic group had greater increase in ratings. You can see it here. The increase in rating for the filled circles, which are the misophonics, is 3 times as high as the empty circles. So this is really showing that people with misophonia, when they're not able to identify the sound, there's not really a difference with people without misophonia, but when they are able to identify the sound, that's when there's that increased kind of heightened response. And that's interesting. So what we learned from all of these results from that first study is that people with misophonia are not simply better at detecting or identifying the sounds. There's nothing really about the acoustics of the sounds that makes them triggers. It seems that people with misophonia are not also just more sensitive to any sound. It has to do with the fact that they show a greater increase in negative emotions when the sounds are identified, and that's especially true for trigger sounds. So that really points towards kind of this idea that there's something in the brain that's telling you this is what the sound is, and that's determining that this is a trigger and you respond to the sound. Knowing that there's this kind of cognitive aspect of thinking and memory, we thought, what can we do? Can we use this knowledge to kind of determine how we can better deal with trigger sounds? Can we perhaps use cognitive resources to be able to better deal with trigger sounds? This is what we did with Project 2. So with project 2, we attempted to see if we could modulate misophonic reactions with cognitive processes. Specifically, we wanted to look at selective attention. This was based on the fact that people with misophonia often report listening to music as a coping mechanism in the presence of trigger sounds. And so we asked ourselves, can we use selective attention to music, which is arguably more pleasant than trigger sounds, to modulate misophonic reactions, to kind of lessen the physiological arousal that you're feeling when you hear a trigger sound. Selective attention here just refers to when there's many things around you and you like choosing to pay attention to something specific. So can we get people with misophonia to choose to attend to music, and can that reduce kind of their emotional arousal? The way that we did this was in person. We had 2 groups, 30 people in the misophonic group and then 30 people in the control group of people with no misophonia that were recruited from the university. We had them come into the lab and do a task where they were presented with the same sounds as in study 1, in addition to piano pieces that they had never heard before, that were sampled from the internet on like an open access database. And what they had to do was that they would come into the lab, they would put headphones on, and then on one side of the headphones, there would be music playing, and in the other side, there would be sounds playing. And we would ask people to either pay attention to the sounds or pay attention to the music. Now, the way that we measured their emotional arousal was with psychophysiological measures, as was mentioned earlier. Psychophysiological measures are measures of bodily activity that is activated basically when emotions are high. And that provides a more objective measure of emotional reaction through things like heart rate and pupil size and the amount of the increased activity of sweat glands in your head, because those measures are activated with emotions. And it's useful, especially in that project, because we know that people often struggle to accurately report emotional states. It is the case that often people can report that they feel a very high emotion, but their body doesn't really respond the same way, or the opposite. So this is what we did. People who did our study were fitted with the glasses that had a camera that looked at the pupil size. Pupil size is supposed to kind of increase with emotional arousal. And then we also had people wearing electrodes on their hands and on their earlobe to detect heart rate and skin conductance, or as I mentioned, the electrical activity of the sweat glands. Anyways. Right now, I'll mention right away, I'm still in the process of analyzing all of this data. So I only have pupil size data to show today, but yes, that's it. So what they had to do was they would be seated in the front of a computer screen and shown an arrow that says, okay, pay attention to the left ear or pay attention to the right ear. Then the music would start in one ear, and then 5 seconds later, the sound would start in the other ear, and they would play together for an additional 15 seconds. And people would be paying attention to one or the other. And meanwhile, all of their physiological measures were being measured. So as I mentioned, here I only have the pupillometry results, so I'll explain this quickly. This, I should mention, it's only for the misophonic group. That's the only data I'm showing today. But we can see, as would be expected, when the misophonic group, when the sound starts, and the people with misophonia are paying attention to the sound, they have a higher increase in kind of emotional responding as opposed to the other types of sounds. We can see that generally the line for trigger sounds, which is red, is above all the other lines throughout the trial. Now, if we look at attention to the piano, that's not really the case anymore. It seems that the line for the trigger sound is actually kind of getting closer to the line for the unpleasant sound. So it seems that with our manipulation of paying attention to either the sound or the piano, we can lower the physiological responding of people with misophonia to trigger sounds. And that's even though the sound is still playing in the other ear, when they're paying attention to the piano, it seems to be reducing. Now, obviously, this is only part of the picture. I don't have all of the other measures of skin conductance and heart rate to be able to tell a better, kind of more rounded story, but I'm working on it, so stay tuned for that. It's a work in progress. Now, our next steps obviously are to compare those results with the other measures I mentioned, and to be able to show a more global picture. And then we also are interested in looking at individual differences, perhaps how much people listen to music or how much reward they get from listening to music. Maybe that has an effect on how susceptible they are to kind of to have that reduced response, or maybe if they have more severe misophonia symptoms or less coping skills, maybe it's harder for that manipulation to work. We don't really know, but that's something we're interested in looking at. Now, I shall mention my next projects because it's very cool, and that's a picture of me in the brain imaging scanner. But we are attempting to do this same kind of study with brain imaging tools to kind of pinpoint what exactly is happening in the brain. And that's very interesting because that tells us more about kind of what parts of the brain we can work on to maybe better improve kind of the skills, the attentional skills that are necessary to do this manipulation. Then we also have another project starting hopefully soon, where we look at the other side of attention, or how triggers can distract people with misophonia from working on their tasks. So anything attention related, I'm interested in and hoping to kind of look more into. But yeah, that's what's happening. And I think it's very important kind of to do this work because we would be providing people with in the moment coping mechanisms that can be trained, because cognitive processes can improve with time and with practice. So hopefully we are able to help people with misophonia by doing this work. So in summary, in study 1, we looked at what makes triggers triggering. We determined that it's not so much in the acoustics of the sounds. It's not really a problem in auditory processing. It really has to do with what the sound is, what the sound means to people. And in study 2, we looked at what we can do about them, or we were still looking, but we have attentional control as a possible coping mechanism, and the possibility of training people to be better at attentional control. Obviously, this stays a in the moment kind of short-term solution, but hopefully that can lead to more long-term solutions and techniques people can use in everyday life. We are arriving at the end of my talk. I want to acknowledge the Misophonia Research Fund, who funds most of my research, and the National Science and Engineering Research Council of Canada, that's a mouthful, for also supporting me. My 2 supervisors, Emily Coffey, who is somewhere in this, somewhere in the participants here today. And then my other supervisor, Michael Desroches, who is not here, but here in spirit. And then everyone I'm working with at Concordia. And that's it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Marie-Anick. Fabulous, fabulous, and always incredible work. Just absolutely incredible work.
Thank you.
I have my own thoughts and questions. I'm going to not start with those, though. I'm going to ask Cris Edwards to go ahead and maybe moderate for us. Excuse me, sorry about this, guys. Bring this down to the very end. To maybe technical incompetence showing. Cris, if you wouldn't mind moderating here and just I'm taking some of the questions from the Zoom and bringing them forth to Marie-Anick if they're about her presentation, or to the broader group, to myself or others if you think that's appropriate.
Yeah, there's about 3 or 4 questions from chat. I'll go in order. A couple of them were kind of covered, but I'd like to get a little bit more information about them. The first one is from Erica about age of onset. I know that that's something we still need more research on, but age of onset for misophonia is anecdotally early puberty or late childhood. Anything on research about understanding the age of onset or if it might happen earlier?
Marie-Anick, would you like to take that question, or would you like to punt that to someone else?
I am not super familiar in that research. I know that there's not a very good idea of when or if there's like a moment that triggers appear. It kind of depends. There's been cases of people developing trigger in late adulthood, but as well as early childhood. From personal experience, I know that I started getting triggered around like maybe 3, 4, 5 years old, so as early as that. But that's my own thoughts about it.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. I'll expand briefly. So there is a little bit of scientific research beginning to ask that question. And as Marie-Anick said, we don't really have the kind of final conclusive answer. But what we do seem to see so far is that most people who are adults reporting in scientific studies about this question, most people report that it's sometime during late childhood or early adolescence. And this is not a way of saying definitively that's when it always starts, or that's when it is caused per se for all people. But it is a way of saying so far, that's about kind of the general range when people report, a lot of people report this. So age 8 to 12, if you want a broad kind of spectrum of ages. But as Marie-Anick said, many people report having earlier age of onset, much younger than 8, age 3, 4, 5 is not terribly uncommon for that other segment of people. And then I would say, just based on the science and also based on my clinical and anecdotal experience, talking with people on a nearly daily basis about misophonia around the world, there are people that develop it in adulthood, and it's quite different. So there are people that develop this as college students. There are people that develop this as adults after college, or if they don't go to college, sort of later in their early adulthood, in their 20s or 30s. I've even had patients who've told me that they've begun having symptoms in their 40s. I think probably there's a sort of a sweet spot where most people are likely to develop it, and then there's lots of folks around it earlier or later that develop. That's how I would think of it. Great question.
Okay, thank you for that. The next question, sort of related to what was covered, but a little bit more information. The question is from Greg. It says, my daughter, when she is upstairs and hears a trigger, comes out and has to find out where the sound is coming from and who is making it. So this is about how the context and source of a trigger must be known by those of us with misophonia. Why is that?
I don't know. That's the main response. I would assume, I mean, we haven't really asked people like specific, I mean, as a group, I'm sure maybe other people have, but we haven't really asked people kind of their own thoughts and experiences with why they need to know those what those sounds is. My best guess is that when you have some kind of reaction, maybe you have a general idea of maybe what it is, and it's kind of legitimizes your reactions to know who is making the sound. But we haven't, I think it would be interesting, probably other people have looked at this, but to ask those questions to people who have misophonia and get kind of a larger more responses about this. But I don't. Okay, it says it's a great answer, so thank you.
It is a great answer. I'll give a different short perspective, which is at a higher level. If you think about what brains do, what human brains do, they really function to keep us attentive to threats, to danger, to things that could harm us, things that could be unpleasant to us. They kind of really, at the end of the day, are 3.5-pound organs of survival. That's what they do. They keep us moving. So if you think about it just at a very high level from that perspective, someone with misophonia's brain might be needing to find, needing to seek, needing to sort of know, if you will, if there is an impending threat that their brain might need to know what to do about. It's kind of like, think about kind of basic biology of animals, even outside of humans. We tend to, and animals tend to be on the lookout for danger, for threat. And that's probably a good thing. It's probably a good thing. And it's just that in misophonia, it may be, and this is a hypothesis, this is not a scientifically determined answer to the question, it's really just a hypothesis worth studying. It might be that there are brain processes in people with misophonia that really are about threat detection, really about kind of identifying and making sense of what the brain's threat detection systems are there for good reason. I'd probably bet that there's something happening at that level, but it's such a good question. And as Marie-Anick said, we don't have a clear scientific answer to that.
All right, thank you. Question from Mercedes, actually. This is a very technical question, so I'll do my best to pronounce these things correctly. Wonder if you also looked at microsaccade as a covert attentional bias as opposed to pupil diameter response that only shows arousal.
We have not, obviously, wait, because I saw this question earlier and I'm a better reader than I am a listener. Okay. No, I mean, we haven't looked at it. Obviously, we are still analyzing the data that we have. I also got advice to look at a number of blinks. So we went into this experiment looking at trying to look at pupil diameter and hopefully when we get heart rate variability, heart rate variability data and skin conductance, we can get kind of a more rounded picture, understanding that a lot of these measures are also activated by other things such as even pupil diameter kind of can be an index of cognitive workload. So all of these measures obviously are sorry, I'm losing my words, affected by a bunch of things. And so we're hoping that with all of them together, we can kind of get to arousal, but that's definitely something else that perhaps would be interesting. But no, we haven't looked at that, at least not yet.
Okay, a question from Marta. Did the participants also assess the emotions / arousal using some scales in the piano trigger study?
No, they did not. They did after every few trials, they did answer on an index of cognitive workload to know how difficult it was to do the task. And so if it was more difficult when they would be trying to pay attention to the piano as opposed to trigger sounds, we did not get subjective ratings of actually like subjective emotional arousal. But that's something that we are doing for the study that we're running right now with the brain imaging, because we did feel like that's something that might be missing. So, yeah.
Okay. From Dr. Hansen, since research is often more complicated than it seems, right? What have you found to be the biggest challenge in studying misophonia so far for yourself, or for anybody, I guess?
Well, for myself, it's pretty easy. When I have to design studies with trigger sounds, it's never very pleasant. But other than actually on the same kind of path, I find that being someone who has misophonia and researches misophonia, I often have to kind of deal with trying to design experiments with using my experience to determine my research questions, but then kind of letting go of my own experience to only look at the scientific evidence that I have in front of me. because that's not how science works. So that's definitely hard, but I think I'm managing pretty well. Then other than that, there's the obvious, no one really knows what misophonia is other than the people in the mesosphere. So often about things like getting funding, getting approval for things, for ethics and stuff. People are asking questions that for you is very like is not even related, but they're asking questions because they don't know what it is. And I saw a couple of comments earlier about people asking about efforts to bring this issue to pediatric healthcare providers or healthcare providers in general. I found that even in a classroom full of psychology students, like graduate level psychology students, most of them training to become psychologists, maybe 3 people knew what misophonia was, and that's because they had heard me talk about it. So definitely still an issue. Yeah, just wanted to touch on that, but that's definitely one of the main challenges in studying misophonia is no one knows what it is.
I'm going to
Awesome.
chime in briefly.
Yeah,
It's
go ahead.
such a great question, Heather. Thank you. It used to be just a couple of years ago when we did these webinars that we would talk about how there was no definition, no kind of agreed upon definition of what misophonia is. So that would have been the biggest problem, is even just kind of starting with what it is at all. We also used to say that there were no measures because there was no clear definition. There was really no good measure of it. What's nice in the last couple of years now since then is that we do now have a consensus definition of misophonia that was published last year. So this is probably still imperfect. Frankly, it's probably an imperfect definition of misophonia, but it is still a starting point that we can all begin with to then, as scientists, can kind of look at it critically and try to see what's missing. Clinicians can do the same, and lay people can do the same, but at least it's a starting point that we can work from to kind of assess, maybe tear down, maybe modify, maybe embrace. We'll see over time, but that's a starting point. And secondly, now in the last couple of years, there are a number of measures that have been built really carefully, really rigorously, really well. And there's not just one, there's actually several now. We could say there's a good handful of really well-developed, kind of like from a scientific perspective, really well-developed measures, thoughtfully, rigorously. So we have a definition to start with, and we now have measures. This is something we should be celebrating. This is a really important first 2 steps. Marie-Anick mentioned funding. So let's also just mention this. The other exciting development in the last few years is that the Misophonia Research Fund has given roughly $12+ million out from a family foundation to support research on misophonia. And truly without that funding, we wouldn't be sitting right here. We would not have these studies. We wouldn't be talking about what Marie-Anick just told us. We wouldn't have her discoveries and her team's discoveries. We wouldn't have a lot of research on this. So that's also a really huge, important thing for us to celebrate and recognize. What I would say as a final step here is that what's hardest for us on the Duke CMER side is we really have limited resources. And as Marie-Anick said, you have to kind of figure, how do we use the limited resources we have to choose which studies to do? The choice of the study is complicated because there's so many things we want to know. There's so many studies to do, and there's only so much funding and time to do it. So thinking strategically about kind of what makes the most sense now to do to be able to get additional funding to do later. And not just to get funding, but to provide really meaningful results that can have an impact on people. We're always thinking in our group about, how does our finding, how do our studies, how do our findings, how do they actually move the needle to help people? That's what this is all about. It's about figuring out ways to do studies that don't just give us, scientific answers, but give us information that can help us get closer to helping people tomorrow. And that's really hard to do. So thinking strategically about how to use funding to get near-term clinical significance. and for everybody with misophonia, not just for a few people or certain demographic segments of the world, but we want to do research on misophonia for all people, including underrepresented, marginalized, minoritized people, including people all around the world globally, everyone. And I think those are some of the biggest challenges we experience as we think about what can we do at Duke to try to advance the field. Thank you for the question.
All right, yeah, there's a bunch of great questions. I'm trying to answer this one, but would you recommend neurofeedback for the anxiety related to misophonia?
You want to take that or no? No. Okay. So no studies have been done directly on neurofeedback for misophonia. Neurofeedback has a long and kind of complicated scientific history, which I will spare you a Professor Rosenthal sort of lecture on, but the sort of too long don't read version is it hasn't really proven over decades to be quite as efficacious and working as a lot of people kind of hoped or thought it would be. That doesn't mean that it can't work. It just means that there's really not, in my opinion, the sort of really robust scientific body of evidence in general that it works for people, and certainly no studies yet with misophonia. It's not something I would start with as a recommendation at Duke when I do evaluations with patients, or when I talk to family members via Zoom for educational sessions. I don't typically recommend neurofeedback. I'm not sure that it would cause harm, although that's also an interesting scientific question too. It's not really something I would consider kind of a frontline treatment to attempt.
I'm posting the video from the CARE event about Dr. Nyaxu's neurostimulation, which is a very different thing, but maybe tangentially related from a layperson standpoint.
Yeah, so neurostimulation is totally different than feedback. Neurostimulation involves stimulating the brain in very particular ways on an outpatient basis, stimulating the brain. And what Dr. Nyaxu in our group here at Duke is doing is kind of pioneering whether and how it can be done with misophonia in a way that might be helpful. And what she's doing that's really important is not just kind of showing that it might actually be helpful, but she's showing kind of how to do it, where you're combining efforts to regulate emotions by way of doing something called cognitive reappraisal. So kind of active efforts to regulate emotions using cognitive reappraisal while getting a kind of a particular type of neurostimulation. And this is not yet scientifically proven to work for misophonia, but she's really doing, I think, incredibly pioneering work in this area to determine if in fact it could be helpful. So stay tuned on that front.
Yeah, I didn't mean to conflate the two. They just kind of reminded me of that talk, which is fascinating. Question from Vivian Black. Are there specific cognitive methods of modifying attention that you are considering including in future studies?
Oh gosh, I have not given this that much thought. We know that cognitive mechanisms can be trained by various different kind of methods and tasks. I haven't really given that much thought to how exactly to do that, but that's definitely one of the next steps. I should mention, I also saw a question about kind of the other side of attention, like how distracting triggers can be and how we can better deal with that. That kind of falls, I think, under the same umbrella of attention can be trained, as can most cognitive kind of processes. So that's a line of the distracting kind of aspect of trigger is a line of research that we're just starting. We haven't even actually started the project yet. We're still in the realm of trying to figure out the protocol and getting ethics approval and all that. But that is definitely one of the things that we want to look at, is improving those processes so it becomes easier and easier to pay attention to something else or to avoid the distraction from triggers. I wanted to say something and now it's just floating out of my brain, but if I think of it, I'll I'll say in the chat, I guess.
Okay, thanks. I think we have time for a couple of more questions. This one says, has there been any established connection between neurological diagnoses and misophonia? Many people with misophonia that I know also have neuro issues such as migraines, et cetera, et cetera.
No, there hasn't been any really clear, conclusive kind of answer to that question. I think to date, the most comprehensive effort to answer that question scientifically was done by our group. We published something earlier in the year, last year, excuse me, and it was a really long questionnaire of, I can't even tell you how many. It was many different types of medical problems that one might have. We looked at all of the different medical problems someone reported having with misophonia and compared that to their misophonia symptom severity. And what we found after controlling for the number of statistical comparisons was that there were no medical health correlates of misophonia severity. The closest thing we found in terms of level of significance, which is not really an appropriate way to even think about this, but since we're just talking loosely as lay people here, the closest thing we found really, it was migraines, but it wasn't statistically significant. That doesn't mean this is the final answer. We just do one study. We think about this as maybe the most comprehensive study to date, but there's a lot more research that would need to be done even more comprehensively than we did to try to really get a clear answer to that. Short answer, no, we don't know, and there isn't anything that's emerged yet.
Gotcha. Thank you. I think we have time for maybe one or two more. There's some really great questions in here. This one from Jody. There's research indicating that disorders like bipolar, Tourette's, ADHD, autism, et cetera, have a common neurological response to sound. A neurotypical brain hears an unpleasant or otherwise sound, and the response attenuates over time when the sound is repetitive. The atypical brain, however, responds with the same level every time. Has there been any research related to this specifically? And then somebody adds to that a pretty common speculation as a culprit of an issue with neural pruning, kind of around age of onset. I don't know if that was too many questions, but
Marie-Anick, you want to take that one?
Sorry, I was answering a question in the chat. I completely missed that.
Oh, that's okay. I'll paraphrase. There's kind of a two-part question from two different people. Looking into the atypical brain and how it responds to the same level of sound every time, it doesn't attenuate. This is kind of a little bit of a sensory gating thing, I think. But has there been any specific research related to how misophonic brains don't attenuate to sounds, whereas a typical brain might? And then secondary to that, do we know if misophonia might be related to neural pruning, which sometimes comes up because of the anecdotal age of onset?
That's a big question. I don't really know about the second part of the question. From the first part of the question about the kind of brain not habituating to triggers, I don't know of very strong research demonstrating anything related to that. It's something that we can probably get to in cases where we would have participants listen to sounds over a very long time and then see kind of how they keep responding over the course of many a long time. But then that gets in the territory of no one would actually want to listen to trigger sounds for 2 hours straight. I don't know that I have a lot of I don't know that I have a lot of knowledge to bring towards that topic. Zach, do you know anything?
Yeah, the short answer is we don't have answers to those two questions that are clear. The second one in particular, I'm not aware of anyone who's even really got close to looking at that question carefully. The first question is something that people have been talking about for a little bit longer doing, and is maybe a little bit more accessible scientifically to try to answer. There are various different methodologies that researchers could use. Cris mentioned sensory gating and looking at kind of a gating response. We did a study years ago looking at this in, not in misophonia, but for people who startle easily. to try to understand that. And we used something called pre-pulse inhibition, or PPI. This is a type of paradigm that's often used. Short answer is there's a number of different paradigms, be it extinction-based learning paradigms or pre-pulse inhibition or startle-based paradigms that look at sensory gating. This is a really good question. I think these are studies that definitely need to be done, but they haven't yet.
Okay. We'll do one more, and then I think we probably need to wrap up. So many great questions. A pretty common question, but I'd like to hear you address it, is about the relationship between misophonia and PTSD or possible past traumas.
I'll take this one since we have a paper under review right now on this topic and some data on this. So what we did in trying to address this question, because it has not yet been scientifically explored in any really kind of careful way, there's just been some correlations between self-report questionnaires of PTSD symptoms and self-report questionnaires of misophonia symptoms. So what we did was we interviewed people using kind of state-of-the-art diagnostic interviews that are used in research studies on psychiatric problems, and we carefully assessed and diagnosed PTSD using these interviews. We also assessed adverse childhood events and PTSD symptoms, and we looked at how those things relate to misophonia symptoms and misophonia severity. And then what we did was we compared those relationships to the relationship between misophonia severity and stress, or perceived stress more generally. And the sort of takeaway is that we didn't find that there's any direct relationship between misophonia and PTSD. We didn't find there's any direct relationship between misophonia and adverse childhood experiences, or kind of childhood traumas or earlier life traumas. What we did find is that there is a strong, significant relationship between people's perceived stress levels now and misophonia, and that that's independent of trauma. Now, we could have a whole webinar on this, and I think we probably should, because all of this ultimately boils down to, how do you define trauma? This question really is important, and it warrants a lot more time to think about it. But if you define trauma with a capital T using kind of DSM-5 criterion A PTSD definitional language, you might get a different answer to your question than if you define trauma with a more lowercase t, which is maybe a little bit more encompassing of what I think a lot of us really mean when we say trauma. We don't necessarily mean it in a sort of exclusive way. So we looked at it first in this sort of more traditional way, and we're not really seeing it's related, but I suspect that processes related to stress, feeling overwhelmed, feeling unable to control your environment, having chronic aversive stimulation, stuff that kind of is what we might think of as lowercase t trauma. It seems to me very likely that a lot of that is probably related to misophonia. We just haven't done that study yet. So we are at 1 o'clock Eastern time here. We're at the top of the hour, and I want to be respectful and mindful of everyone's time. And thank you, Chris, for moderating our discussion. Thank you, Marie-Anick, for your presentation and for your answers in the discussion. Thank you to everybody who's been here and who participated today. And thank you to everybody on YouTube who's watching this later on in the future. If you have questions that weren't answered, feel free to send them to me directly. You're welcome to do that. My email address is mark.rosenthal, ROSENTHAL, @duke.edu. If you'd like to support the work we do, please reach out to me as well. If you have any needs, please reach out. We're happy to be a support for people. Thank you, everybody, and we'll see you next time.